Hi students, this is your instructor, Diane Yell, and I'm going to be going over the basics of framing a source in your essays. So the first thing, I'm kind of coming up with a hypothetical here. So you have an assignment and it's an argumentative or an analysis paper that you have to write, and you need to use sources. So you can use sources by way of quoting, summary, or paraphrasing them, and we're going to focus today on quoting a source and using framing with that quote. So you've done some preliminary research and writing to the point where you know what your point is, and you have your sources, and you have sources that have a conclusion. So you just don't have sources that state a fact or statistics, but these sources are people or a bunch of people who have a message that they're trying to convince their reader of. And you know that your point is, in this particular one, that a college student's individual responsibility is to control external distractions. So we're focused on the topic of how technology affects learning. So you've taken the article Nicholas Carr, which in our class everyone's read, on how smartphones hijack our minds, and you think that it would be relevant in using this for your to make your point. And you've selected from it, putting the quote, putting some distance between ourselves and our phone, which is the last sentence that Carr states in this Wall Street Journal article. So typically students just plug that quote in and tack on his name at the end, and um, and then skip on to another point. Well, in expository writing, in an argument, in an analysis, you cannot do this at the college level. So you have to uh, explain to your reader, and this is very important that you keep your reader in mind as you're writing. All right, so you must state who your credible source is. So remember, your sources have to pass the CRAP test. So make sure, otherwise you're going to waste your time starting to quote someone and then have to delete the source because they're not credible. Two, you need to point out what your source, in this case it's a he, was talking about in the source so that you fairly represent what the source is the point they're trying to make. Then you also need to supply your interpretation of what he's saying, given the point you are making, and explain how that source says how that source affects your point. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. So expository writing, right? It is different. So maybe you've read a novel or you've read a local newspaper article, and they use quotes differently. They don't have to do all this explaining. Well, again, this is an expository essay you're writing, and I give the analogy here that it's similar to math. So uh, 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 if this were a math problem, it's more than just bubbling in a correct answer. You actually have to provide all the steps of your work. So a lot of times when you take a math test, the professor will have you write out all the steps you did in solving this equation, so that if along the way you do the majority of the things correct, but you make a mistake or two, then the instructor can point out where you made the mistake. So simply said, this expository essay you're writing is very similar to listing all the steps in a long division example. You are unpacking your thinking along the way. And framing is one way to show how you're using your sources. So I start off with 3-to-1 must-haves. This is the ratio, 3-to-1. So for every idea you use from a source, and a source can be something you quote, something you summarize, or something you paraphrase, you have a minimum of 3 sentences that do the following. So again, I go over this. Introduce the credible source to the reader. Provide the context of where you took the quote from. Then you provide the source. Okay, in this example, it's going to be quoting, all right, from the text. And explain how the source's ideas connect to the point you're making. So that's the basics. Now, if if the idea from the source is very complex, then it's going to increase. You may need to use 5 sentences to one, or 7 sentences to one, or 10 or more. Remember, you are trying to communicate to your reader how you are thinking. So you have to show all the steps so that your reader understands how you got your answer, how you arrived at the point that you're making. So this first step of in MLA and other citation guides like APA in Chicago and other ones will change the way you cite this. This is MLA. Introduce the source by using the first and the last names. Okay, so in our source, we're going to use the name Nicholas Carr, and then you need to make them credible according to who your reader is. All right, so I give you an example: Pulitzer Prize finalist for an audience who reads a lot, or noted journalist and author for an audience who doesn't read a lot. Okay, Wall Street Journal journalist for a business-minded audience. So you do have to think about who you are writing to. And you have to research who the author is, right? And you should have done this before you decided to use their quote. So here's an example of me just very quickly Googling Nicholas Carr, and just the basic information that's listed on Google was enough for this essay at this level to provide the basic information on him. So, whoops, let me go back up. Sorry, I'm trying to scoot the frame over so that you can see everything I wrote, right? So this basic information provides enough for us, but sometimes the source has a common name. You have to research more to make sure that you've got the right, Bill Smith, or maybe it's an academic person and you can't find a lot of information on them. So sometimes you really have to dig deeper in order to find out who the source is, in order to make that person credible, or those people credible, to your audience who you're writing to. So the next thing you need to do is you should provide the context so that you don't misuse what they say, like so much of the media does with whoever they quote. So in this paper, you're trying to make sure the audience understands the point that your author was making. So in this example, if including context of what Nicholas Carr is saying, it's in a 2017 Wall Street Journal article, right? Nicholas Carr, noted journalist and author, analyzes the effects of smartphones on our minds. That would be sufficient enough at this level to be able to explain where you got the sentence from, okay, which is actually his conclusion, right? So now, the use of the context depends on the knowledge of your reader, which will change in upper division courses. So if you're going into criminology and you have a basic source that's always cited, I'm not familiar with criminology, but you're not going to have to state who the source is. The majority of the people reading your paper are going to know who they are. But for now, this is freshman level comp, so just assume that your reader is unfamiliar with the sources that you are using. Okay, so now you can use the quote. So here's the quote that we've been talking about that we're going to use. Okay, so here is what we've done. In a 2017 Wall Street Journal article, Nicholas Carr, noted journalist and author, analyzes the effects of smartphones on our minds and recommends putting some distance between ourselves and our phones. Now, this is an online source, so we don't have a page number, but if you were to have a page number, you would put the page number after that, okay? So I'm not going to change the slide to show you how to do that, but you can look up how to put in a page number after a quote. So, but you are not finished framing yet, okay? You've started, but you're not finished. So now, remember that you're the one making a point and you're using your source to make this point. So now you have to explain to your reader how you interpret what the person's saying and explain how it connects to the point that you're making. So here it is. Okay, so here's an explanation. So in other words, and you'll notice in academic essays and that you're reading now, often an author will say in other words, or his point is, or the author's point is, and that's the kind of signal phrase that you're saying is you're letting us know what you think this means. So in other words, not eliminating cell phone use altogether, but exercising self-control to not be distracted by a handheld gadget. So now the next sentence is going to connect it to the point that you're making. Thus, college students are responsible for choosing whether to be distracted by where they place their smartphones in their hands, hidden under the desk, on their desk, or their backpack, or outside the classroom. Okay, so and so that the next part here is this matter of making sure that your sources are making your point rather than allowing the source to make your point for you. So one of the ways to do this is to use a topic sentence before you introduce your source. So here is, while college administrators are starting to define cell phone policies in the classroom, college students are adults and thus responsible for their own actions. So that would connect to the conclusion, the thesis statement that the student is trying to make in this particular essay, where they quoted putting some distance between ourselves and our phones. So in this PowerPoint, I have strongly recommended that you frame every source you use in your document, but you always have to remember who your audience is. So keep your audience in mind, right? So if you've introduced your source on page 1, you don't have to introduce your source on the next page because your reader will remember who they are. Okay, you do need to cite where you got the source from, either briefly, but you don't have to go into who he is, make him credible, the context of the source. They should be able to remember that. But if you mention car on page 1 and then not until page 10, and you have a bunch of sources in between, then probably your audience is going to forget who he is and needs to be reminded. And you shouldn't do exactly the same kind of introduction. You should change it up a bit, and just kindly remind them about what he said before and now what he's saying now. So thus, when you write to an audience and you guide them through your reasoning. So this PowerPoint has been on how to frame your sources in an academic essay where expository kind of writing is needed to put forth every step, the majority of your steps of your reasoning in either an analysis paper or an argument paper.